Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're heading into the dusty, dangerous world of the Wild West to explore one of its strangest and most misunderstood jobs. What was it really like to be a bounty hunter? Were they heroic lawmen, ruthless killers, or something in between? And how did a system built on money and wanted posters turn ordinary people into hunters of other human beings? We'll look at how bounty hunting actually worked, who the real bounty hunters were, and how the lack of strong law enforcement in the frontier created a world where tracking down outlaws became a business. It is a story filled with danger, greed, and more than a few strange characters, far different from the legends we see in old movies. I'm Tim, and I'll be your host tonight. If you feel like it, share in the comments where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you, whether you are settling in for sleep or just drifting through history. Thank you for being here. Now, let's begin. A thin sheet of paper slapped against a rough board outside a small post office, and a man with a hammer drove 2 nails through the corners fast. Dust hung in the air where the street met the porch steps. A wagon creaked past with a load of hides. Across the road, a saloon door swung as someone pushed through it, boots thudding on the plank walk. The paper carried a face drawn from memory, a name spelled with hard, uneven letters, and a promise written in plain figures that made people stop, squint, and lean closer. Reward, cash. A sum that could pay off a saddle, a team, a parcel of land, a year of rent, a doctor's bill, a debt that kept a man awake. The notice sat at eye level among older scraps that curled at the edges. Strayed horses, a missing boy, a church social, a freight schedule. This one held the street in a different way. The poster turned a private fear into a public offer. It said that the man in the sketch had taken something and run. It said that a stranger could bring him back. It told any passerby that the chase belonged to whoever had the nerve and the time. In frontier towns, formal authority often arrived late, and it arrived thin. A sheriff might cover a county so large that a rider could spend days crossing it. A judge might sit for a short term, then move on, leaving warrants folded in a drawer. A jail could be a single room with a barred window and a door built by a carpenter who also built wagons. The force behind the badge relied on neighbors who owned rifles and horses. When a theft turned violent, when a stage was held up on an open road, when a payroll box went missing from a rail stop, a town met the problem the way it met: prairie fires and floods. Together, quickly, with whatever tools were on hand. A reward became one of those tools. It transformed anger and panic into a number. It gave a storekeeper a way to call for help beyond a circle of friends. It gave a bank a way to reach riders in other counties. It gave a railroad a way to put pressure on a man who could vanish into the next territory by nightfall. The offer did not need a courtroom to exist. It needed money, a name, a description, and a place to post the notice where people gathered. The earliest rewards in America belonged to older patterns of public notice. Communities offered money for escaped prisoners, for stolen horses, for thieves who slipped away before a posse formed. By the time settlers pushed west in larger numbers, the habit traveled with them. The West added distance, speed, and profit to the equation. Gold camps in California pulled together strangers from dozens of states and several continents, and a thief could disappear into a crowd that changed every week. Cattle towns sat along rail lines where cash moved in sacks and boxes, and that cash drew men who lived by taking it. In mining districts, ore and payrolls traveled on predictable routes, and the men who planned robberies watched those routes the way a rancher watched water and grass. The growth of newspapers gave rewards a stronger voice. Printers in small towns ran handbills alongside advertisements for patent medicine and farm tools. Editors printed descriptions with the confidence of men who believed words could do work. Height, build, hair color, scars, a limp, a distinctive hat, a brand on a stolen horse, a habit of chewing tobacco, a way of holding a pistol. Clerks wrote down whatever witnesses could recall, and those details spread across county lines by stage, by rail, and later by telegraph. A printed reward made a criminal's face familiar to people who had never met him. It created a rough network of eyes, and it worked best in places where everyone watched strangers and everyone asked questions. The wording on those notices carried its own hard logic. Some promised money for capture and delivery to the nearest jail. Others promised money for a body. Some spelled out a sliding scale, a larger amount for the leader, and smaller amounts for the men around him. A bank might post a reward after a robbery and add a private line saying the money would be paid quietly to the person who brought back the stolen funds. Rail companies offered their own sums, and they employed special agents who traveled with papers folded in their pockets, ready to recruit local help. County commissioners authorized public rewards when voters demanded action after a murder. Ranchers banded together and pooled cash after a wave of cattle theft. The sums rose with the fame of the outlaw and with the embarrassment of the victim. A small theft could spark a modest offer, enough to cover expenses and pay for a few days away from work. A train robbery could bring a figure that made men count their savings and picture a new life. The notice told the public what the authorities wanted, and it also revealed what the authorities could afford. It exposed a town's desperation in the clearest language possible. Once the reward went up, the work began in the open. Men rode out in pairs or small groups, following tracks along creeks, checking camps, asking at ranches, scanning the faces in every saloon. A storekeeper might ride with the sheriff for a day, then return to his counter. A ranch hand might join a chase and come back with a story that grew larger each time he told it. Some men made a habit of these hunts. They learned how to read ground where a horse had turned or slowed. They learned which roads outlaws favored and which river crossings stayed shallow. They learned which stable owners asked no questions. They learned to listen for a name spoken softly in a gambling room. They also learned the math of it. The cost of ammunition, food, and fresh horses came out of a man's pocket. Time away from a job carried its own price. A reward that sounded rich on paper could shrink after a week on the trail. The men who stuck with it grew practical. They looked for bounties that offered enough to justify the miles, and they learned how to approach the law so that a capture counted. A body delivered to a courthouse carried different consequences than a rumor delivered to a saloon. That system created a profession by accident. The frontier did not build a licensing office for bounty hunters. It built a market, Posters and handbills turned crime into a set of transactions, and those transactions attracted men who understood pursuit as a skill. Some had worn badges, some had robbed before. Some came from families that treated hunting men the way other families treated hunting deer. The work required a strong stomach, a steady seat, and a willingness to walk into tight spaces where a gun could already be drawn. It required patience, too, because many hunts ended in empty cabins and cold trails. In time, as rewards spread through newspapers and telegraph lines, a man could ride from one county to the next with a stack of notices, choosing which names to chase and which towns to avoid. The West filled with faces that people knew from paper, and the distance between a crime and a pursuit shortened. A robbery in one place could lead to a chase that crossed 3 territories. A killing outside a rail stop could bring riders to a ranch 40 miles away by the next day. A single posted reward could pull strangers into a partnership built on money and risk. The men who nailed those papers to boards outside post offices often believed they were buying safety. Sometimes they bought justice. Sometimes they bought trouble that lasted longer than the paper stayed on the wall. A man stepped into the county clerk's office with sweat darkening the back of his shirt and a bedroll tied behind his saddle outside. He set his hat on his knee and asked, plainly, what the reward paid and who signed for it. The clerk looked at the notice pinned to a board near the door, then at the man's hands, then at the rifle leaning against the wall. A deputy sat at a table with a ledger open, pencil poised, ready to write down a name. Across town, the same questions came up in the saloon, at the livery, at the feed store, and by the water trough. How much? For whom? Alive or dead? Whether expenses came out first? Whether the sheriff would vouch for the claim? A reward turned conversation into accounting. It pushed men to measure risk the way they measured flour and nails. A laborer making $1 or $2 a day could stare at a reward of $500 and see months of work in a single ride. A rancher behind on a note could see a way to keep his land. A gambler broke after a bad night could see a chance to get even with his luck. The offer did not care who answered it. The offer waited for a man willing to follow tracks into rough country. Reward money created a set of incentives that shaped behavior in small, visible ways. Men rode faster. They slept less. They spent money in advance on ammunition, coffee, bacon, and a fresh horse, then told themselves the reward would cover it. They carried a second pistol because they expected a fight. They watched strangers more closely in town and asked sharper questions. They entered a barber shop and looked at the customer list tacked by the mirror. They stood near the stage stop and studied faces under hat brim. Some used caution, and some used aggression. A careful hunter learned a target's habits, waited near a ranch gate, and tried to take a man alive for the sake of a clean claim and a cleaner conscience. Another hunter fired first because a dead man carried fewer surprises. The wording on a poster mattered. Dead or alive gave permission in 3 words. It let a hunter treat a fugitive as a moving target instead of a prisoner. It also made a shortcut seem acceptable. In many places, the sheriff had little patience for formalities, and the crowd had even less. A body on a wagon could settle fear in a town quickly. A living prisoner created questions about jail space, guards, and trial dates. Money and public praise mixed together, and that combination drew men who wanted both. A hunter who brought in a notorious outlaw could walk through town with people staring at him in admiration or caution. Some men liked that attention. They leaned into it by telling stories that made the chase sound longer and the gunfight sound closer. Newspapers helped. Editors printed names and printed sums, and they described a capture with details that made it feel like a public event. A hunter who read his own name in print could return to the same work again, chasing the next reward with the sense that the public watched and approved. Some sheriffs used that energy for their own ends. A sheriff who faced re-election benefited from a dramatic capture. A railroad agent benefited when the public believed the company protected its freight. A banker benefited when depositors believed the vault stayed safe. The reward served all of them, and it served the hunter too. In the same towns, the reward also set a trap for people caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. A rough sketch and a vague description could fit more than one man in a territory where half the population wore similar clothes and rode similar horses. The sheriff had to make a decision quickly, and hunters pushed for quick decisions because the money depended on it. Some people ended up in a cell because they shared a height, a beard, and a hat style with the man on the paper. The greed around rewards produced its own crimes, and people in frontier towns learned to watch for them. A hunter could bring in the wrong man and argue loudly until a clerk paid anyway. A group could stage a capture by arranging for a friend to play the role of a fugitive, then split the money. A rancher with a feud could accuse a neighbor of theft and push for a reward that drew armed men into the dispute. Outlaws understood the system and exploited it. Some hid in plain sight by traveling under a different name, keeping their hair trimmed and changing horses often. Some used decoys and rumors, planting false reports in saloons so hunters rode the wrong direction. Some turned themselves in under conditions that protected them. A fugitive might approach a sheriff he trusted and negotiate, expecting a short sentence in exchange for information about other criminals. When that happened, a hunter who arrived late with a rope and a demand for money found a sheriff who refused to cooperate. In counties where fees and rewards blended together, the lines became difficult to see. A sheriff collected fees for serving papers and escorting prisoners. A hunter expected a payout for labor. A county commissioner watched the budget. A town watched all of them and talked about favoritism. Every payment produced gossip. Every refusal produced anger. The moral pressure on hunters showed up in the small details of daily life. A man could carry a reward notice folded in his pocket and still shake hands at church on Sunday. He could still help a neighbor mend a fence. He could still sit at a family table and eat supper. Then he could mount his horse at dawn with a rifle across the saddle. Some hunters told themselves they did the work for public safety. They repeated the names of victims, the storekeepers shot during robberies, the stage passengers beaten on the road, the ranch hands left tied in the sun. They used those facts as justification for hard choices. Others treated the work as a trade and kept their thoughts on money, distance, and speed. Those men spoke about targets like they spoke about cattle, as a count and a payoff. Their behavior was visible. They drank more heavily when a reward slipped away. They argued over who fired which shot. They insisted on standing close to the clerk when a payment was counted. The community responded to those differences. Some towns offered food and lodging to a hunter they trusted. Some towns watched a hunter with suspicion, especially when a man died on the road without witnesses, and the hunter returned with a body and a story. The deeper problem sat in the structure itself. A reward created pressure for results. It turned time into money. It tempted a hunter to skip the slow work of confirming identity. It tempted a sheriff to accept a doubtful claim because the town demanded an ending. It tempted a victim's family to push for a killing because grief sat close to anger. Frontier life already carried violence in plain view. Men carried guns daily. They fought over cards and whiskey. They shot at predators near livestock. The reward system fed into that world and sharpened it. It also provided real benefits. It pulled fugitives out of hiding when local law enforcement lacked manpower. It allowed small communities to extend their reach across vast distances. It made outlaws more cautious because they faced pursuit from men who had never met them and who did not owe them loyalty. The same system produced killings that never went to trial and arrests that never reached a judge. It produced careers built on reputation, and it produced funerals that left families asking questions that no one answered. In the West, a piece of paper with a number on it could steer a man's choices for weeks, and those choices shaped lives in ways that a clerk could never measure in a ledger. A deputy watched a man swing down from the saddle outside a courthouse and saw the way he handled his reins. The horse stood quiet. The rider carried himself like someone who spent years moving fast and sleeping light. He walked inside with his hat in his hand, waited his turn, and spoke with calm words about a job. The deputy heard the request and studied the man's face, the scar near his jaw, the hard set of his mouth. The West produced men like this in numbers that surprised Eastern visitors, men who had lived by force, men who had fled from warrants, men who had crossed a river at night to avoid a posse, then showed up months later in another county with a different name, a clean shirt, and a steady gaze. They did not arrive with a public confession. They arrived with a story that fit the place. A former cowhand, a former driver, a former soldier, a man who wanted work. The clerk asked for a name. The man gave one. The clerk wrote it down. A badge waited in a drawer, and sometimes the drawer opened for a man who had spent years on the other side of the law. In many frontier communities, credentials mattered less than results. A sheriff needed men who could ride hard, handle a gun without panic, and keep their head during a fight at close range. Some of the best candidates carried a past that stayed quiet. A county did not run background checks. A sheriff asked questions, listened to local talk, and made a decision. Railroads did the same with their special agents. Private detectives did the same with their hired hands. A man who had robbed a bank once could still become useful because he understood how a bank could be robbed. He knew which doors a thief would pick. He knew which alleys a man could use to slip away. He knew the habits of men who traveled with a pistol and a plan. That knowledge translated into pursuit. It also translated into surveillance. A former outlaw could sit in a saloon and recognize the small signals of a planned robbery, the quiet meeting in a corner, the glance at the door, the hand that stayed too close to the coat. A sheriff could value that skill more than a spotless record. The town often agreed because fear shaped judgment. A town that had been hit by a robbery or a murder wanted a person who could stop the next one. The badge became a tool. The man behind it became a kind of solution, and the past stayed behind a curtain as long as the present stayed quiet. This pattern created some of the most unsettling careers of the period. A man could start as a cattle rustler in Texas, run with a crew that drove stolen stock at night, then face arrest when a sheriff finally caught up. If he escaped custody, he could ride out of state and cut ties with everyone who knew him. He could change his name in a hotel register, then change it again at a rail stop. He could drift into Wyoming or Colorado, hire on at a ranch, build a new circle of acquaintances, and keep his head down until someone needed a hard man for hard work. The distance between outlaw and lawman could be a single decision by a local official who cared more about order than origin. Some men aimed for that shift on purpose. They learned that a badge provided protection. A badge granted access to information and horses and weapons. A badge opened doors in towns where a stranger would otherwise draw suspicion. A badge also gave cover. A man with a badge could ask questions without raising alarms. He could ride into a settlement and request a room without anyone wondering why he traveled alone. In that environment, a past as an outlaw carried a practical advantage because the man had already learned how to survive pursuit and how to read the habits of people who lived by breaking rules. The work itself encouraged that overlap. Hunting fugitives required patience and deception. It required the ability to sit quietly and listen. It required the ability to enter a ranch house, drink coffee at the table, and keep one hand near the belt. It required the ability to ride into a camp at night and give an order in a steady voice. Men who had spent time among thieves often carried those skills in their bones. They knew which talk sounded false. They knew which promise would be broken by morning. They knew how quickly a man could go from friendly to violent once the door closed. Some were hired as deputies for a short stretch, then returned to private work when the money ran out. Some were used as trackers. Some were used as informants. Some were treated as specialists who stayed outside official structure while still receiving quiet support. They carried warrants in their pockets and claimed rewards when they returned with a prisoner. They also faced suspicion from ordinary citizens who understood the danger. A storekeeper who had been robbed did not always trust a man with a dark past, even when he wore a badge. People watched for small tells. They watched who the deputy greeted in town. They watched who visited his table at the saloon. They listened for rumors that the deputy met former partners outside town at night. In places where everyone knew everyone, a secret life proved hard to maintain. In places full of strangers, a secret life proved easier, and that ease helped criminals become authorities, and authorities become criminals. This same overlap produced betrayals that paid well. A man who once ran with an outlaw crew could turn on the group when reward money rose high enough. He could ride ahead, share a location with a sheriff, and help set a trap. He could do it for payment. He could do it for personal safety. He could do it because he had fallen out with the crew. The results were concrete. A camp surrounded before dawn. A prisoner hauled to town in irons. A body carried back on a wagon. Those outcomes fed the reward system and strengthened the belief that anyone could be bought, because in many cases anyone could. Outlaws understood that, and they responded by tightening their circle and punishing suspected informants. That cycle pushed violence upward. It created a constant pressure inside outlaw groups, because trust became a daily problem. It created a constant pressure inside law enforcement as well, because sheriffs relied on tips from men with their own agendas. The people who lived in those towns saw the consequences. They saw a deputy marshal drink with a man who had once been wanted in the next county. They saw a known thief walk free after a short jail stay. They saw a rancher who had stolen cattle become a respected member of a posse. They saw a hired hunter bring in a prisoner and collect money, then disappear from town before anyone asked questions. The West did not run on clear categories. It ran on reputation, immediate need, and whatever stories people accepted at the moment. A few men carried that transformation further and built long careers from it. They began in trouble, then enforced the law with the same energy they once used to break it. They arrested men they once would have ridden with. They served warrants in towns where they once hid. They built working relationships with governors and judges and railroad men, and they learned the language of official reports, the careful phrases that made violence sound orderly. In later years, some admitted the truth to officials and asked for formal forgiveness, using their lawman service as evidence that they had changed their direction. Others kept the secret until the end and left it for others to piece together from old arrest records and whispered recollections. People who lived through the era remembered the results more than the origin. They remembered whether the stage line ran on time. They remembered whether the bank stayed open after a robbery. They remembered whether a string of killings stopped. The men who delivered those outcomes often carried a past that would have ended their chances in a different place. On the frontier, the badge and the bounty often rested in the same hand, and that hand sometimes belonged to a man who had once run from the very posters nailed to the post office wall. He rode into a Texas town with dust on his boots and a name that still belonged to his past. He kept his head down as he passed the storefronts and the hitching rails. Men in that country watched strangers the way they watched clouds that meant rain. A glance stayed on you a second longer than polite. A question came quick and plain. Where you came from, who you knew, whether your horse carried a fresh brand. For Josiah Horner, the answers never stayed simple for long, because his life had already taken shape around theft and flight. He grew up in a Texas that moved fast and fought hard, where cattle ranges stretched wide and where a young man could slip into rustling with little ceremony. He learned how to handle a horse at speed, how to sleep outside, how to stay alert in the dark. He also learned how quickly a single bad decision became a chain of them. Before he had years enough to soften his temper, he had already taken up with men who measured success by what they could take and how cleanly they could get away. Banks held cash in towns that sat alone on the plains. Freight moved along routes that everyone knew. Cattle drifted across open land. A man with a pistol and a plan could make money fast. That life also drew attention fast. Sheriffs, pazis, private guards, and angry citizens followed the same roads, asking the same questions, and carrying their own rifle. The trouble caught up with him the way it usually did, through a jail door and a set of irons. One arrest did not end his options. It narrowed them. He sat in custody and watched men walk past his cell, and he listened to talk in the hall. He heard the routine of the place. He learned which guard relaxed at certain hours. He learned where a key hung. He saw how a door sat in its frame. When the moment came, he took it. He escaped custody and vanished into the West with the kind of urgency that leaves no room for sentiment. He had no interest in being carried back for another trial, another sentence, another wait behind bars. He moved like a man who understood that survival depended on speed and distance. He changed his appearance as much as a man could in that era with simple means. He trimmed hair and beard. He swapped clothes. He traded or stole horses when he had to. He changed his name, which mattered in a country where paperwork traveled slowly and memory traveled through rumor. He became Frank Canton. The name sounded ordinary. It sounded like it belonged on a payroll list or a voter roll. It fit the kind of towns that needed labor and law, and it gave him a chance to step into a new life without a past dragging behind him in plain sight. Wyoming offered that chance in the 1,880 seconds. The territory drew cattlemen, drifters, hired hands, and businessmen who arrived with money and expectations. Ranches grew large, and the men who ran them wanted order along the ranges. A cattle operation depended on predictability. It depended on herds staying whole, on brands staying respected, on trails staying open. A thief who could slip cattle out of a herd threatened a rancher's livelihood as directly as drought or disease. Towns wanted safety for their streets, and they wanted it at a practical level. They wanted drunken fights controlled. They wanted a steady hand at the jail. They wanted someone who could ride out after a stolen horse and bring it back. In that setting, Canton presented himself as a man suited to enforcement. He knew horses, he knew guns, he knew how criminals talked and how they moved. He also knew how to speak to men with money. He listened. He answered questions without letting emotion show. He offered certainty. Those qualities counted. He gained trust, job by job, until he held positions that required official confidence. He served as a lawman in Wyoming, with responsibilities that placed him on the side of sheriffs, courts, and the power of warrants. People accepted him because he delivered results. They saw him on the street with a steady step. They saw him ride out with a deputy and return with a prisoner. They saw him keep order when tempers rose. A quiet reinvention can succeed in a place hungry for competence. That reinvention carried strain because a past like Horner's did not vanish from the world. It waited in records, in old memories, in the talk of men who moved across states, and in the habits that stayed in a man's body. Canton carried those habits. He slept light. He watched exits. He kept his weapon close. He chose his words with care. He also carried the simple fact that he had once lived by breaking the law, and that fact shaped the way he enforced it. Some lawmen relied on formal procedure and patience. Canton relied on pursuit, pressure, and personal judgment. He knew how criminals tested authority and how quickly they ran when they sensed weakness. He also knew how easily authority could be abused because he had seen it from the side of the hunted. In that era, a lawman worked with thin support. The nearest reinforcement could be a day's ride away. A telegraph message could sit unread if a line went down. A posse could refuse to ride if the weather turned or if a harvest needed hand. A man like Canton learned to act with what he had in the moment, with the people in front of him. That style made him effective. It also made him feared. As the years went on, his career expanded beyond a single town's needs. The West pushed into Indian Territory, where federal authority carried different structures and different tensions. The area that would become Oklahoma drew settlers, merchants, outlaws, and fugitives from surrounding states. Men ran there to avoid warrants. They hid among new arrivals. They took advantage of rough jurisdiction and the gaps between local and federal enforcement. For a lawman, that environment required stamina and a willingness to travel, and it demanded comfort with conflict. Canton worked there as well, serving in official roles that placed him in the orbit of U.S. Marshals and their deputies. Those officers pursued criminals across long distances, and through communities that had their own rules. They depended on trackers, informants, and local guides. They also depended on men willing to confront armed fugitives face to face. Canton fit that demand. He carried the same sharp focus that had kept him alive in Texas, and he used it in service of warrants rather than escaped. The most startling detail of his life came later, when he faced the old truth directly. The name Frank Canton had carried him for years. It had placed him in positions of authority and placed him in contact with governors and officials who could change the direction of a life with a single decision. In the later years, he disclosed his original identity to the governor of Texas and received a pardon. That act revealed a long calculation. It suggested he believed his service as a lawman had built a record strong enough to stand beside the crimes of his youth. It also suggested he wanted stability in his final years, a way to live openly without fear that an old warrant would be pulled out and used. The West offered second chances, and it offered them in a form that depended on reputation and usefulness. Canton's path showed that truth in a hard way. A man who began as Joe Horner had the capacity to remain a fugitive until death. He chose a different route. He took a new name, built a public career, and lived with the tension between the two lives every time someone asked where he came from. A bell over a wooden door gave a thin ring as a customer stepped into a small meat market near Pawnee, Oklahoma territory, and the smell of fresh-cut beef and sawdust filled the room. Behind the counter, a man in a stained apron wiped his hands on a cloth and kept his eyes on the visitor's belt and boots before he looked at the face. A ledger lay open beside a tin box for coins. Hooks and knives hung within reach. A second man stood near the back where sides of meat cooled in the shade, and he watched without speaking. Outside, wagons rolled over rutted streets, and the town carried the steady noise of horses at hitching rails, men talking on boardwalks, and doors opening and closing all day. Pawnee had the look of a place still deciding what it would become, with buildings thrown up fast, signs painted bold, and a flow of people that included farmers, traders, drifters, and men who kept their names to themselves. In that kind of town, a business did more than sell goods. It created a steady point where information moved. Customers talked while they waited. They complained about prices. They argued about politics. They described strangers they had seen on the road. They repeated the newest reward notice and the newest rumor about who planned to claim it. The Dunn brothers understood that better than most. Their names carried through Pawnee and beyond it. Bill, Bee, Dal, George, and Calvin. People sometimes mixed up which brother was which, because they worked together, they rode together, and they backed one another in public. They were a family that made money through plain work and hard choices. They ran a boarding house for men passing through. They ran the meat market. They dealt in cash. They dealt in favors. They built a reputation for being practical men who could handle trouble. A man who rented a bed in their place might share a room with a farmhand one night and an armed drifter the next. A man who bought meat might also buy time, asking questions about who had come through town, who had left in a hurry, and who had been seen with a strange horse. The Dunns listened. They remembered faces. They stored details like a shopkeeper stored inventory. In the territory, knowledge could be worth more than any single side of beef. It could point to a wanted man. It could point to stolen property. It could point to a gang moving through the country, looking for the next job. The Duns also carried a past that fit the roughness of the place. Stories followed them about cattle taken without permission, about robberies, about nights spent with men who lived by taking what they wanted. Those stories did not float in the air as vague talk. They attached to specific names and specific events in nearby counties, and they shaped the way people looked at the brothers when a deputy walked into their shop. A lawman might greet them with a polite nod and still keep his hand close to his belt. A merchant might smile and still count his change twice. The Duns responded by staying calm and steady in public. They did not flinch under suspicion. They did not apologize. They treated questions with the same tone they used for ordering supplies. They knew the territory had room for men who could hold their ground. They also knew that the same traits that made a man successful as an outlaw could make him useful to law enforcement. The brothers had grown up around horses, guns, and open land. They knew the back roads. They knew where a man could cross a creek without leaving obvious tracks. They knew which farmhouses took in strangers for a meal and which ones locked the door at dusk. Those skills did not disappear when a reward notice went up. Those skills became part of the reward economy. Reward notices reached Pawnee in stacks of paper carried by riders and rail lines. A notice might be tacked on a post office wall by noon and discussed in the saloon by evening. When the reward involved a gang that worked the territory, the talk sharpened. Men leaned in closer. They spoke names carefully. They described weapons and horses with the same detail they used for weather. A gang could ride through and take a payroll, then disappear into brush and ravines that made pursuit slow. Lawmen relied on tips from people who saw the gang move. Rail agents offered money for names and locations. Counties offered money for capture. Private victims offered money out of their own pockets. The Duns stood at the center of that flow because their businesses pulled people in every day. When outlaws needed food, they bought it. When outlaws needed a bed, they paid for it. When outlaws needed a quiet corner to talk, they looked for places where no one asked many questions. The Duns could provide those things. They could also provide the opposite. They could point a deputy toward the right road. They could delay a man at the counter long enough for someone to step out the back door and ride for help. They could set a trap by making a promise and breaking it at the moment that paid best. That double role made them dangerous in a way that did not require fancy talk. A hunter who chased strangers had to ride blind into unfamiliar country. The Duns did not chase blind. They lived among the people they might later betray. They shook hands with men who carried pistols under their coats. They served meals to men who stole for a living. They listened to plans spoken low over coffee. Then they weighed the value of loyalty against the value of a reward. The sums offered for certain fugitives in the 1,890 seconds could change a family's future, and the Duns ran their lives like a family business. They kept accounts. They counted costs. They expected profit. A man who lived on wages might turn away from a dangerous bounty because a week of riding could end with a bullet and no money. The Duns had more control over the situation. They could wait for the wanted man to come to them. They could choose the moment. They could involve several brothers at once and bring more guns to bear. Their knowledge of local law also helped. They learned which lawman would accept their claim without delay. They learned which official wanted results and would ask fewer questions. They learned how to present their story afterwards so the paperwork moved in their favor. People in Pawnee saw the outcomes without seeing all the steps. A gang member would vanish from the territory, and the Duns would show up in town with news and acclaim. A deputy would ride in and speak with them behind a closed door. Then a paper might arrive stating a reward had been paid. Some townspeople treated the Duns as useful men who helped clean up a violent territory. Others treated them as men who sold whoever stood closest when money appeared. Both views grew from the same set of facts. The Duns stayed armed. They kept together. They built relationships with lawmen when it suited them. They kept relationships with outlaws when it suited them. Their boarding house put them in reach of strangers at night. Their meat market put them in reach of nearly everyone during the day. The brothers did not have to travel far to find trouble. Trouble walked through their door and set its hat on their table. The territory itself encouraged that kind of arrangement. Pawnee sat in a place where jurisdiction could twist. Local law could conflict with federal law. A man wanted in one county might find comfort in the next. Deputies carried authority that depended on cooperation from people who had their own interests. Rail companies hired agents who acted like lawmen without wearing the county badge. Farmers and ranchers formed poses when theft hit their own property. In that mix, the Duns carved out a space where they could operate with both sides and still present themselves as necessary. Their businesses gave them cover for the constant movement of men in and out. Their family ties gave them strength during confrontations. A single brother might hesitate. 5 brothers standing in a doorway with guns and a plan created a different situation. Men who visited the boarding house understood that. Men who bought meat understood it too. They watched their words. They watched their hands. They understood that the Duns listened closely, and that a single careless detail could travel from a dinner table to a deputy's ear by the next morning. Rose Dunn washed her hands at a basin near the back of the boarding house and wiped them on her apron before she carried a plate into the dining room. Men sat close at a long table, shoulders turned toward their food, eyes lifting now and then to check who had entered. Boots stood in a line along the wall. Coats hung from pegs. A few rifles leaned in a corner where they could be reached fast. Outside, the yard held a wagon, 2 saddled horses, and a pile of split wood. The place ran on routine, and Rose kept the routine moving. She poured coffee. She cleared plates. She listened because the men talked as they ate, and they often talked as if the room belonged to them. They complained about the cold, the dust, the price of feed, the behavior of deputies, the latest robbery on a road they all used. They mentioned names in passing, sometimes with a laugh, sometimes with a quiet tone that made other men stop chewing for a moment. Rose heard those names and stored them like any person who lives around constant traffic. She knew which men arrived alone and stayed quiet. She knew which men carried fresh bruises or a new cut. She knew which men paid with coins and which men paid with bills folded tight. She knew which men came in pairs and looked out the windows before they sat down. Her brothers treated the boarding house and the meat market as a family operation, and they treated the territory as a place where a person survived by staying alert. They spoke plainly at home. They spoke about money, debts, supplies, and risk. They also spoke about wanted men, reward amounts, and the way the law worked in practice. Rose lived inside that talk. She could hear a reward figure the way she could hear the number of cattle in a drive. She could hear the tone of her brothers' voices shift when a name carried real value. She saw men arrive at the house with news and leave with a decision already made. She saw her brothers saddle up quickly, guns checked, ammunition counted, and a plan spoken in short phrases. She also saw their calm faces at the table afterward, as if the ride had been a normal errand. That style of life shaped her understanding of danger. It made danger feel common. It made it feel close. It also made the rare moments of ordinary happiness stand out, because ordinary happiness required fewer calculations. George Newcomb entered that world as a person with a reputation. He rode with men who stole and fought. He moved under pressure because lawmen and hired hunters watched for him. People who knew his name also knew the name of the gang he kept company with. In the territory, that name carried a practical meaning. It meant robberies that shut down business for days. It meant possess, riding out and coming back tired and angry. It meant newspapers printing descriptions of faces and horses. It meant reward notices nailed up in towns that Newcomb might pass through in the night. For Rose, the first contact with him carried the simple facts of a man standing in front of her. He had a horse, he had a hat pulled low, he had dust on his clothes and a gun on his belt. He had a way of watching a room as he stepped into it. He spoke to her as if she mattered. He looked at her directly. He asked for water. He asked for food. He asked questions about the road. In a place where many men spoke to women with either rough familiarity or cold distance, that attention could feel sharp and personal. Rose responded with the small acts that formed a connection. A plate set down without haste, a cup filled to the top. A few words exchanged when her brothers were occupied with customers. A relationship like that did not grow in private. It grew under eyes. It grew under the scrutiny of a household where brothers already knew the names and habits of wanted men. Rose had fewer places to hide her feelings. Her brothers could see the time she spent near the window when a rider might appear. They could see her linger on the porch after dusk. They could see the way her face changed when a particular name came up in conversation. Even if she said little, the household routines gave away patterns. A family business ran on observation. Her brothers had practiced observation on strangers for years. They applied that skill to their own home without effort. When Newcomb appeared again, the brothers could measure the situation with quick glances. A wanted man coming to their place created a problem with a clear price tag. The territory offered reward money for certain fugitives, and Newcomb carried value because lawmen had trouble catching him on open ground. A man like that did not enter a town openly. He did not stand under a wanted poster and ask for a drink. He arrived at a ranch or a boarding house where he expected some kind of safety. That expectation often came from personal ties. Rose provided a tie. Her brothers understood that tie as a weakness and an opportunity at the same time. They had built their reputation on being useful to people with money and useful to people with authority. A high reward promised a quick gain. It also promised a stronger position in Pawnee. Men would talk about it in the saloon. Deputies would remember who delivered results. Customers would come in with respect mixed with caution. Those outcomes had value beyond the cash itself. Rose faced a hard reality in simple daily scenes. A man she cared about could sit at her table and laugh in a low voice, then rise and step outside to check his horse and his pistol. Her brothers could sit across from him and talk about weather and roads while they counted his movements. She could see the tension in their posture. She could see the way their hands rested near their belts. She could see the way they watched the door, the windows, the yard. If she tried to argue, she had to argue against more than a family opinion. She had to argue against a system built into the territory. Reward notices existed. Lawmen existed. The cash offer sat like a concrete fact, written down and repeated by everyone. A family that already lived close to that system felt its pull even inside their home. If she tried to protect Newcomb, she had to do it with practical steps. A warning given at the right moment, a request made when her brothers stood farther away, a delay created by asking for help in the kitchen, a message passed to a friend. The choices required timing. They required courage. They also required understanding that Newcomb lived under constant pursuit, and that he might treat any hint of betrayal as a reason to move fast and move armed. Newcomb carried his own pressures. A wanted man learned to use relationships for shelter. He also learned to accept risk, because risk came with each stop for food and water. If he returned to see Rose, he took a risk he understood. The reward money made that risk larger. People in the territory knew the numbers. They repeated them in loud voices, as if the reward itself would draw the outlaw closer. A man like Newcomb could hear those numbers in the same way he heard hoofbeats behind him on a hard road. He had to decide whether affection outweighed caution. He also had to decide whether the Dunn household remained safe. Safety depended on loyalty, and loyalty depended on more than words. It depended on actions taken when a reward notice made every decision expensive. Rose could offer affection. Her brothers could offer hospitality. The territory offered money for a corpse or a prisoner. Those offers existed at the same time, in the same yard, under the same roof. Every visit carried the possibility of a final confrontation. Every conversation carried the possibility that someone in the house already made a decision and waited for the right minute to act. Two riders came up the track toward the Dunn place on the morning of the 2nd of May 1895. Their horses moved at an easy pace, heads low, hooves striking dry ground and patches of damp earth where the shade held the night's moisture longer. George Newcomb rode in front, a broad-brimmed hat pulled down and a coat that sat loose over his belt. People called him Bitter Creek, and the name followed him across the territory the way a reward notice followed a face. Charlie Pierce rode beside him, a little behind at times, scanning the fence line and the brush near the creek. Both men carried guns. Men like them always did. They had spent years moving from hideout to hideout, eating when they could, sleeping when they dared, and keeping their eyes on the edges of every yard they entered. They also carried a reason for coming that morning that made them drop their guard. Rose Dunn lived there. Newcomb had visited before. He expected a familiar face and a familiar porch, a brief rest, a drink of water, a few minutes of ordinary talk before he moved again. He expected that because he wanted it, and because he believed the Dunn place offered a private corner away from deputies and hired men. The Dunn brothers had prepared for his arrival in the quiet way a family prepares for bad weather. They did not ride out looking for him. They waited. They had information about when he might come and which road he would take, and they used that information like a tool. Bill Dunn moved around the yard early, checking where a man could stand without being seen from the gate. Bee and Dal watched the approach from points that gave them clear lines of sight. George and Calvin stayed close enough to join fast. Each brother carried a weapon. They positioned themselves behind structures that were already part of daily work: a shed wall, a corner of the house, a fence section where boards created gaps to look through. They kept their talk short. They did not waste time with arguments once the decision was made. The reward on Newcomb's head sat in their minds as a number: $5,000, and another $5,000 for Pierce. Those sums meant concrete things. They meant land payments. They meant inventory for the shop. They meant a cushion against illness or drought. They meant status in Pawnee, because men talked about who brought in a prize. They also meant danger because Newcomb and Pierce arrived armed, and a plan that failed could end with a brother dead in the dirt. When the riders reached the gate, Newcomb swung down first. He handed his reins over a fence rail, looped them, and patted the horse's neck once. Pierce did the same, keeping his horse closer, as if he might need to mount quickly. Newcomb stepped forward into the yard, boots pressing into grass and bare ground worn down by constant use. He looked toward the house and called out in a steady voice, using Rose's name. He walked with the ordinary confidence of a man who had survived long enough to believe his instincts served him. Pierce stayed near the horses for a moment, then followed, eyes moving from the porch to the outbuildings. The yard held the small signs of a working place: a bucket by the well, a pile of chopped wood, a trough, a wagon wheel leaning against a wall. Nothing in those objects warned the visitors. The warning came from men. The first shot cracked the air from a hidden position, and Newcomb's body reacted before his face had time to register the sound. He jerked, staggered, and turned toward the direction of the gunfire. Another shot followed, then more, tight and fast. Pierce tried to move back toward the gate, one hand reaching down, one foot searching for traction as he pivoted. A bullet struck him and folded him down near the yard's open ground. Newcomb tried to draw his gun. He shifted his weight and pulled at his coat, then another shot hit him and knocked him off balance. The brothers kept firing until both men stopped moving. The entire encounter lasted moments. It produced smoke from the gun muzzles, sharp smells of burned powder, and the flat thud of bodies hitting the ground. The horses pulled back against the reins, ears laid back, hooves scraping. Then they stood trembling when no one moved toward them. The Dunn brothers came out of their positions with guns still raised and eyes fixed on the fallen men. One brother circled wide, watching the tree line beyond the yard, because outlaws rarely traveled without friends. Another stepped closer and kicked a gun away with the toe of his boot, then picked it up carefully by the grip. They spoke to each other in short commands. They checked Newcomb first, then Pierce, looking for a breath, a blink, a twitch of fingers. They rolled pockets, took what they needed for proof, and kept their movements controlled. Rose came to the porch when she heard the shots, her hands held close to her body, her face tight, her hair pulled back. She saw the two bodies in the yard and froze, then took a step forward and stopped again. One of her brothers said her name and told her to go inside. She did not argue in that moment. She turned stiffly and moved back into the house, her shoulders high, her hands clenched at her waist. The brothers stayed outside. They stood over the bodies, and their attention shifted from the immediate risk to the next task, turning two dead men into a claim. They knew the steps. A reward required official recognition. A sheriff or deputy had to confirm identity. A payment required paperwork and witnesses. A family that lived on the edge of the law still understood the value of a clean record when money was involved. They loaded the bodies onto a wagon with the practical speed of men used to hauling heavy things. They wrapped them enough to keep limbs from dragging, tied them down, and hitched a team. The wagon creaked as it rolled away from the yard toward Pawnee, passing fence lines and open fields where a few farmhouses sat far apart. They rode alongside with rifles across their laps, watching the road ahead and behind. In town, people gathered when they heard the news. Men came out of shops, women watched from doorways. A lawman stepped forward and looked at the faces closely, comparing them to descriptions printed on notices and repeated in talk for months. Someone said the name Bitter Creek out loud, and the word traveled through the crowd. The Dunn brothers gave their account with steady voices, describing the arrival, the threat, and the shooting. The bodies were examined, the guns were noted, the names were confirmed. The numbers followed after that, because reward money always came down to numbers. $5,000 for Newcomb, $5,000 for Pierce. The Dunns had turned a visit built on trust into a transaction, and the territory rewarded them for it. The town did not agree on what to call the act, and the disagreements showed on faces and in whispered talk that lasted long after the wagon had been unloaded. The brothers had made a choice that brought money and attention. They also made enemies, because outlaws had friends, and because people in the territory watched every example of betrayal and learned from it. The wagon that carried Bitter Creek, Newcomb, and Charlie Pierce back into Pawnee left a mark on the town that lasted longer than the tracks in the road. People who had watched the Dunn brothers collect reward money now watched the roads with a sharper eye. Men at the livery talked about who might come looking for payback. Storekeepers locked up earlier. Deputies listened longer before they spoke. The killing also landed on the desks of federal officers who worked the Indian Territory and the Oklahoma Territory, men who had spent years trying to break up the Doolin gang and the wider circle of robbers who used the territory as a hiding place. The outlaws had robbed trains, held up stores, taken payrolls, and slipped away through a web of farms, river bottoms, and small settlements where they could blend in for a night. A county sheriff could do only so much. Federal marshals and their deputies carried broader authority, and they brought a different kind of pressure. They traveled more, coordinated across longer distances, and relied on a steady stream of tips, paid for in cash or in quiet promises. In that world, a bounty and a warrant worked together. A wanted notice put a face and a name into every post office. A warrant gave a lawman the right to act. A reward gave other men a reason to help. After the ambush at the Dunn place, more people decided that helping could be profitable. Heck, Thomas moved through that system with a tight focus and a practical routine. He worked as a deputy U.S. Marshal, and he built his reputation through persistence, long rides, and close fights. His work depended on information, and information rarely arrived as a neat report. It came as a rumor in a saloon, a whispered message passed at a store counter, a letter dropped at a post office, a ranch hand talking too freely after whiskey, a frightened family reporting visitors who paid in cash and left before sunrise. Thomas treated those fragments like pieces of a trail. He compared descriptions, timed movements, and asked local people the same questions again and again until an answer stayed consistent. He worked with other deputies who had their own strengths, men who could track, men who could talk their way into a camp, men who could ride hard for days. They approached towns quietly, checked with sheriffs, and watched who lingered near the edge of town. They looked at horses first, then at saddles, then at men. A good horse and a worn saddle could say more than a man's name. The Doolin gang relied on speed and familiarity with the land, and Thomas relied on patience and numbers. He preferred to catch a man in a place where escape routes were limited, at a farm gate near a creek crossing, outside a house at dawn. The goal stayed clear. He wanted the leaders. Bill Doolin stood high on that list, and his name carried a reward large enough to pull attention from every corner of the territory. The chase for Doolin played out in bursts. A robbery would bring a wave of pursuit. Deputies would spread out, riding to likely hideouts and questioning anyone who might know a route. Then the trail would go cold. The gang understood how to break a pursuit by splitting up, changing horses, and using friends for shelter. They moved between small towns, ranches, and remote camps where a meal could be cooked with little smoke and where a horse could be watered out of sight. When lawmen closed in, the gang left quickly, taking the first safe road and keeping miles between them and the last known location. Thomas kept pressure on them through arrests of associates and through steady attention to their supply lines. He watched for the men who bought ammunition in bulk, the men who suddenly needed 2 extra horses, the men who carried messages between camps. A gang could survive gunfights. A gang struggled when its friends lost confidence. That was where bounty hunting and law enforcement overlapped in a way that made people nervous. A former associate could trade information for money. A rancher could call in a deputy after a suspicious visit and then claim a reward for help that led to a capture. A boarding house owner could remember a face and a name, then decide that memory had a price. In the months after the Dunn ambush, more people considered that option because they had seen the reward money paid out in full. The Dunn brothers sat inside that changing mood with a reputation that cut in 2 directions. Some saw them as useful allies for lawmen, men willing to do what deputies could not. Others saw them as men who would sell anyone when a reward rose high enough. Either way, their names stayed in the conversation. They continued to run their businesses. They continued to listen. They also stayed armed and ready, because the territory contained men who took betrayal personally. The federal deputies who hunted the Doolin gang needed local support, and the Dunns had local knowledge, local influence, and a willingness to act. That willingness brought them close to the machinery of the manhunt. It also brought them close to suspicion, because rumors followed them about their own crimes, and people in Pawnee watched the brothers for signs of trouble. In a territory where deputies depended on informants, informants depended on reward money, and reward money depended on proof, relationships became tense. A lawman could accept help and still keep a careful distance. A business owner could cooperate and still fear retaliation. A family like the Dunns could gain power through their role in captures and still invite scrutiny from officials who believed the same men might also be robbing on the side. The pressure built in public and in private. It showed in the way people lowered their voices when they spoke names. It showed in the way riders turned their heads to check who followed them out of town. It showed in the way a simple walk down the main street could turn into a standoff when 2 armed men recognized each other and each believed the other had crossed a line that could not be repaired. A man stepped off the boardwalk in Pawnee on the 6th of November 1896, and the first thing several people noticed was how he carried his hands. Frank Canton moved with a steady pace and kept his head level. He had a clean look for a frontier lawman, hat set straight, coat buttoned, gun riding on his belt where it sat ready. He had spent years around men who lied for a living, and he asked questions in a way that gave little away. Pawnee had heard his name long before that day. People in town knew the Dunn brothers too, and they knew the town had lived through a hard season of gossip. The Dunn ambush at their place the year before had brought them reward money and brought them attention, and then the attention started to turn. Men in saloons spoke about robberies and missing cash. They spoke about who seemed too flush with money for the work they claimed. They spoke about who walked with more confidence after a job went wrong. Pawnee was a small place in practical terms. People watched who came to town. People watched who left. When a lawman like Canton started asking about the Dunns, the questions moved through town faster than any official notice. Canton's work brought him into contact with the kinds of complaints that never stayed on paper for long. A merchant would talk about money that disappeared after a delivery. A rancher would talk about cattle that drifted out and never came back. A rail agent would talk about a box that went missing between stops. A deputy would talk about a suspect who slipped away with help. These accounts rarely arrived in neat order. They arrived mixed with anger, fear, and personal grudges. Canton treated them as information to be checked. He spoke with storekeepers. He spoke with deputies. He spoke with men who ran livery stables and knew which horses were hired and when. He also spoke with the Dunns in the public way that kept doors open. A lawman could not walk into a family business and accuse 5 armed brothers without preparation. Canton gathered enough detail to form a picture. Then he moved with care. His presence in Pawnee carried a clear meaning. He represented authority that did not rely on local friendships. He represented a kind of pressure that reached beyond town loyalties. For the Dunn brothers, that pressure posed a real problem. Their success had depended on being close to everything that happened in Pawnee. Their boarding house and meat market placed them in the path of news. Their connections placed them in the path of wanted men. Their willingness to act had brought them reward money. The same habits that made them effective also made them vulnerable when an official decided to test their reputation. Bill Dunn carried the family's public face. People argued about his exact nickname, and people often mixed names when they spoke quickly, yet they understood his role. He stood at the counter. He spoke for the brothers. He handled conflict with a direct stare and short sentences. He also carried the part of the family's story that drew the most resentment. Some men in town believed the Dunns acted like heroes when it suited them, then acted like outlaws when it paid better. Those men watched Bill closely. They watched him when he entered a saloon. They watched him when he rode down the street. They watched him when a deputy passed by. In the days leading up to the shooting, tension sat in small details. People stepped aside sooner when the Dunns approached. People lowered their voices. A few men avoided the boarding house entirely. Others went there anyway, drawn by habit and the simple need for a bed and a meal. Canton kept moving through town, speaking with the same controlled tone. Bill Dunn watched that movement and decided that waiting would make him look weak. In a place where reputation functioned like a shield, weakness drew trouble. The confrontation came in daylight on a street where people could see. That mattered. Pawnee had the kind of main road where wagons rolled through mud when it rained and dust when it stayed dry. Shops faced the street. Saloons faced the street. People drifted in and out. A few stood near doorways, hands in pockets, pausing longer than needed because they sensed a moment coming. Bill Dunn stepped into view with his coat on and his hat set low. He did not approach with a friendly posture. He approached with intent. Canton stood in the open, body angled in a way that allowed a quick turn. Both men knew what the other carried. Both men understood that talking could end in a gunshot. Bill's right hand moved toward his pistol. The motion happened fast. The problem came just as fast. His suspenders caught the gun or his coat bunched against the grip, and his draw slowed by a fraction that mattered. Canton's hand moved with the smooth speed of a man who had practiced for years and who had lived through situations where hesitation got people killed. His pistol cleared leather, the muzzle lifted. 2 shots cracked in quick succession. Bill Dunn jerked back, then fell hard, knees folding first, body tipping, dust rising around him when he hit the ground. The sound bounced off the storefronts. A few people flinched. One man near a doorway stepped back quickly and pressed his shoulder to the wall. Another stood frozen with his mouth open. A horse tied to a rail tossed its head and stamped once. Canton stayed upright with his gun still raised for a moment, eyes fixed on the fallen man. He did not rush forward. He waited and watched for movement from Bill's hands, for any attempt to reach the weapon again. He lowered his pistol only after he saw that the threat had ended. A deputy moved in from the side, cautious, eyes wide. Someone called for a doctor. Someone else ran toward the nearest saloon door to fetch help. People gathered in a half circle, careful with their feet, careful with their voices. Bill Dunn's brothers would hear within minutes. Towns carried news in a way that depended on bodies moving, not on wire messages. Men ran, boys ran. A shopkeeper leaned out and asked what happened. A woman stepped onto a porch and held her apron at her waist with both hands. Canton spoke to the closest officials in a short, controlled voice. He gave the explanation that fit the facts the witnesses had just seen. Bill Dunn had attempted to draw on him. Canton had fired first. The witnesses had watched Bill's hand move to his gun. The street itself had served as the record. The aftermath unfolded as a series of practical steps. The body was moved with care. The weapon was collected. Names of witnesses were written down. Canton stayed available for questions, because a lawman involved in a shooting could expect scrutiny even in a rough town. Yet the judgment moved quickly. Pawnee understood ambushes and street fights. Many people had seen men reach for a gun and die for it. In the days that followed, the story settled into a form people repeated. Bill Dunn had tried to kill Canton. Bill Dunn had failed to draw cleanly because his suspenders caught. Canton had been faster. That detail became a way for people to explain the outcome. It also became a detail people argued over because some people treated it as proof of bad luck and others treated it as proof of carelessness. The larger point stood firm. The most visible Dunn brother had died in the open, in front of witnesses, at the hands of a lawman who carried his own complicated past. The shooting changed the Dunn family's position in Pawnee. A family built on unity could survive many things, yet the loss of a leader created cracks that outsiders could see. Some people treated the death as justice, others treated it as a warning. A bounty hunter could earn money by betraying outlaws, and a bounty hunter could also become a target when the same methods turned inward. The town also learned something about Canton. He carried himself as a man who did not bluff. He asked questions. He followed suspicion to its end. He responded to a gun draw with immediate force. That reputation held weight in a territory where men tested authority daily. It also added to the long list of frontier stories where a person's life ended in a few seconds because a hand moved toward a holster in front of the wrong witness, on the wrong day, in the wrong town. Men carried Bill Dunn's body from the street with a stiff care, hands under shoulders and knees, boots sliding on dust as they stepped around the blood on the ground. A shopkeeper held a door open. A deputy walked close with his hand near his belt, eyes shifting from face to face in the crowd. Someone brought a blanket and laid it over the body once it reached a back room. Then the room filled with the smell of sweat, leather, and gun smoke that clung to coats after a shooting. Outside, the street kept moving in small, broken ways. A wagon rolled past slowly, the driver staring. A horse stamped at the hitching rail and shook its head. A woman on a porch tightened her grip on a child's shoulder and turned them both inside. People spoke in short phrases, and the same sentence repeated as it moved through town, each time with a slightly different detail. Bill Dunn tried to draw. Frank Canton fired first. The gun caught. The suspenders caught. 2 shots. Over. By afternoon, Pawnee had settled into the practical work that followed violence. Someone sent for a doctor to confirm death and look at wounds. A local official wrote down names of witnesses and asked each one to repeat what they saw. Men described the angle of bodies, the movement of hands, the distance between the 2 men, the way Bill's coat shifted as he reached for the pistol. People used the simplest words because they wanted the event to fit into a clear category. Self-defense, murder, accident, a fight. A man did not die in the street without the town trying to label it. Canton stayed visible and available. He spoke with officials without raising his voice. He kept his posture straight and his hands calm. His badge carried weight, and his manner reinforced that weight. He knew the cost of hesitation during an inquiry. A lawman involved in a killing needed to look like a man who expected scrutiny and accepted it. A few men in the crowd watched him with narrowed eyes anyway. Some of them had business ties with the Dunns. Some owed the Dunns favors. Some carried their own anger over the ambush the year before and saw a chance to settle accounts. Canton's supporters stood near him, and they held their own positions with quiet firmness, feet planted, arms loose, ready to move if a brother or a friend of the Dunns tried to start another fight. The Dunn family heard the news fast. A rider took the message to the boarding house with dust flying off his horse's hooves. When the brothers arrived in town, they did not come in a single group at first. One came ahead to find out where the body lay and who stood guard. Another hung back near the edge of town, watching who moved where. A third went to the meat market to secure the place and speak with anyone who might know more. Their response showed their habits. They treated danger as a problem solved through positions, numbers, and timing. Yet the street had already chosen its outcome. Bill Dunn lay dead, and the witnesses had already spoken. The brothers had to absorb a reality they could not reverse. In town, men watched them closely for any sign of a rushed draw or a sudden shot. The brothers kept their hands away from their guns. Their faces stayed hard. Their steps stayed measured. They had lived by reputation, and now their reputation faced its first true weakness. A leader in the family had fallen in public, and everyone had seen the moment it happened. The next days brought more changes than the Dunns could control. Their businesses depended on steady traffic and on a sense of safety. A boarding house filled when travelers believed they would sleep through the night without a gunfight in the hall. A meat market prospered when customers believed a simple transaction would remain simple. After the shooting, customers hesitated. A man stood at the corner and looked toward the Dunn place, then turned away and walked to another shop. Another man entered, bought what he needed, and left quickly without taking a seat or making small talk. The Dunns still had their connections. They still had family loyalty. They still carried weapons and knew how to use them. None of that solved the problem of fear. Fear reduced business. Fear pulled people into their homes earlier at night. Fear made deputies more active, because a town that sensed trouble demanded visible enforcement. Canton's presence in Pawnee also changed the tone. People who had whispered about the Dunns now spoke louder, because the most intimidating brother had died and a respected lawman stood nearby. A rumor that once felt dangerous to repeat became safer to mention. Stories about robberies and missing cash circulated with more confidence. Some of those stories were true. Some carried exaggerations. The effect remained the same. The Dunn name began to sit alongside words like suspicion and risk in the same breath. The legal decision came through the usual mechanisms of the time. A local inquiry took statements, compared them, and confirmed the basic sequence of events. The town needed a ruling that let it move forward. Canton's shooting of Bill Dunn was treated as self-defense in the way such incidents often were when witnesses agreed on the initial motion toward a gun. The ruling mattered in concrete ways. It allowed Canton to continue his work. It prevented a cycle of formal arrests and jail time that could have sparked a wider shootout among supporters. It also pushed the Dunn brothers into a corner. They could pursue revenge outside the courthouse process. That choice carried its own risk, because deputies would watch them closely, and because they had already lost one brother in open daylight. They could also accept the ruling and shift their energy into survival and business, hoping time would cool the anger and reduce the attention. Either option carried cost. Revenge could end with more deaths and the collapse of their businesses. Restraint could look like weakness to their enemies and could invite more pressure from lawmen. Inside their own household, the consequences showed in simple scenes. A chair sat empty at a table. A bed stayed unused. A brother reached for a familiar tool and paused, because the person who usually handled that task was gone. Rose moved through rooms where people spoke less freely than before. Her brothers had already made choices that shaped her life, and now another choice had shaped their future. She had seen a man she cared about killed in an ambush. Now she watched her family absorb a public killing of their own. The grief in the house did not come with speeches. It came with silence during meals, with cups left half full, with boots set down hard at the door. It came with the way one brother stared out a window longer than necessary, checking the yard and the road. It came with the way a gun sat cleaned and loaded on a table and stayed there for days. The Duns lived in a place where morning often arrived, mixed with preparation for the next fight. Pawnee carried on, because frontier towns always carried on. Wagons still came in, cattle still moved along roads, the post office still received mail, the saloons still filled at night, yet the town's memory held the shooting as a reference point. People spoke of time in relation to it, before the street fight and after the street fight. Deputies used it as a warning when they told young men to keep their hands away from their belts during arguments. Shopkeepers used it as a reason to lock up earlier. Travelers used it as a reason to choose a different boarding house. The Dunn brothers remained in town, and their presence continued to create tension even when no one raised a voice. Canton's reputation grew, because he had faced down a feared man and survived with the town watching. The reward economy did not disappear. It adapted. People still posted notices. People still talked about cash for captures. Yet the Dunn story showed another side of the trade. A man could build a life on betrayals and claims and then lose it in the street when a lawman decided the line had been crossed. A lantern bobbed along a fence line before dawn, its light catching on wire and rough posts as two mounted men moved slowly toward a low cabin. One rider held the reins tight and kept his horse from snorting. The other dismounted and walked in a crouch, boots placing carefully on packed dirt. A third man waited farther back near the road, with a rifle across his saddle, watching the dark space between the cabin and the tree line. The men had a name written on a paper in a pocket, and a description of a scar and a gate, and a promise of money if they brought the right person to the right official. These scenes happened across the West in different forms, and they did not always involve the same kind of hunter. Some wore a badge issued by a county. Some carried federal authority. Some worked for a railroad or a private agency and kept their papers in a leather folder. Some rode alone and relied on instinct and luck. The common thread was pursuit. The West offered many roads to that work, and the men who took those roads looked and acted differently from one another. A quiet deputy could ride for days with a warrant folded in his coat. A private agent could arrive by train with a valise and a stack of photographs. A local tracker could follow hoofprints through river sand and point to a direction without saying much at all. In Indian Territory, one of the most effective lawmen came from a background that forced him to rely on skill and caution every day. Base Reeves traveled long distances on horseback, often working with little support, and he built his reputation by finding fugitives who believed they could hide in rough country. He rode through heat and storms, crossed creeks, slept outdoors, and approached cabins with the careful habits of a man who expected a gun to come up fast. Witnesses later described him as calm and direct. He carried official authority as a deputy U.S. Marshal, yet he also moved through the same reward economy that shaped so much of frontier pursuit. A warrant came with fees. A capture could connect to rewards posted by counties, rail companies, or private victims. Reeves relied on practical methods. He asked questions in small settlements. He used disguises when it helped. He learned family ties and travel routes. He watched for a man who suddenly bought supplies and left before sunrise. He watched for a horse with a familiar brand. When he found his target, he worked to control the first seconds of the encounter, because the first seconds decided whether a prisoner reached a courthouse alive. Accounts of his career describe hundreds of arrests across his years of service. People repeated those numbers because they matched the scale of crime and flight in the territory. They also repeated his name because he represented something rare in that environment, a steady officer who kept returning to the work even after long rides and close calls. Farther west and north, another kind of hunter worked in clothing that fit a train platform better than a cattle trail. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency built a private force that followed criminals across state lines and built files on suspects with an attention to detail that impressed clients. A railroad company that lost money to robberies wanted results. A bank that faced repeated theft wanted an investigator who could track patterns, identify accomplices, and gather evidence that held up in court. Pinkerton agents collected statements, compared handwriting, tracked telegraph messages, and built networks of informants. They used photographs when they could get them. They carried circulars that described faces, scars, and habits. They watched rail depots and hotel registers. They shadowed suspects in towns where a local sheriff might already be compromised by friendship or fear. Some agents worked with lawmen, some worked around them. Their authority came from contracts and from the influence of powerful clients, and that influence could move a local official to cooperate. A Pinkerton man could arrive in a town, rent a room, speak quietly with a station agent, then wait for a suspect to appear on the next train. The work involved less open riding and more observation. It still carried danger. A suspect who realized he was followed could draw a gun just as quickly in a hotel hallway as on a trail. The rewards mattered here as well. A company could offer money for information, money for capture, money for property returned. Those offers pulled in local eyes and local talk, and Pinkerton men used that talk as fuel for their own investigation. Other hunters lived in the spaces between official law enforcement and private work. Some served briefly as deputies, then returned to ranch work, then took another pursuit when a reward rose high enough. Some operated as range detectives hired by cattle associations, tracking rustlers who stole animals in small numbers that added up over time. A stolen horse created a chain reaction. A ranch hand could not work without a horse. A rancher could not move cattle without riders. A county could not function without people able to travel. Because of that, horse theft brought quick pursuit and strong emotion, and reward notices for stolen horses could appear within hours. In that environment, a tracker who understood brands and trails carried value. He could look at a hoofprint and tell whether a horse moved fast or slow. He could see where a rider paused, where the horse drank, where it turned off a main road to avoid attention. He could follow a trail into timber, then lose it on hard ground, then pick it up again where the horse crossed a sandy wash. These hunters rarely wrote reports. Their work showed up in results. A man returned in custody. A horse returned to its owner. A stolen herd recovered from a hidden valley. Some of the most feared figures in this world came from experience in violence and used that experience as a tool. Tom Horn stands as an example of a hired gun who took on tracking work tied to cattle conflicts and disputes over theft. He moved with confidence around armed men and carried a reputation that made people uneasy. His presence could settle an argument quickly because people believed he would shoot. That belief functioned as its own form of force. Work like his showed the darkest edge of private enforcement, where the goal shifted from arrest to removal, and where payment sometimes followed a death that never reached a courtroom. Other men built reputations that stayed closer to official structure. Bill Tilghman worked as a lawman in the territory and gained respect for steady enforcement, and he operated in a time when deputies needed both courage and restraint to keep a town from turning into a gunfight. In different places, in different years, men like these crossed paths with the reward system and with bounty work. A poster or a warrant could pull them into a chase. A victim's family could pressure officials to act. A railroad agent could add money to the offer and increase the number of riders on the trail. All of these hunters shared one working reality. They depended on information, and information came from people with their own motives. A bartender might talk because he feared the next robbery. A rancher might talk because he wanted his cattle back. A rival outlaw might talk because a reward promised a new start. A frightened family might talk because armed men had used their barn for a night. Each piece of information carried the risk of error or manipulation, and the best hunters learned to test what they heard. They compared dates. They compared description. They asked the same question in different ways. They watched whether a story changed from one telling to the next. They also learned that time mattered. A fugitive could move 20 miles before breakfast. He could change horses by noon. He could cross a county line before dusk. The men who lasted in this work developed habits that looked simple from the outside. They rose early. They traveled light. They kept their gear in order. They treated every closed door as a possible ambush. They treated every friendly greeting as a possible delay. That discipline separated the successful pursuers from the men who chased a single reward and never chased another. A printer pulled a fresh sheet from a hand press, lifted it by the corner, and held it up to the light to check the ink. The paper carried a bold title, a list of names, and a promise of blood and reward that fit easily on a single page. Within days, the sheet would be folded, tucked into saddlebags, pinned to walls, and read aloud in saloons. Men who had never left their county would hear about robberies in other territories, as if they had happened on the next street. This was how the West learned to recognize faces it had never seen, and how it learned to admire certain kinds of violence. The same raw material that fed reward notices also fed entertainment. Editors wanted readers. Showmen wanted paying crowds. Writers wanted stories that moved fast and ended with a clear result. In that setting, bounty hunting became a ready-made subject because it offered chase, confrontation, and a final moment where money changed hands. The details could be adjusted with little risk. A witness was hard to find. A court record might sit far away. A man could change his name and move on. In towns where people relied on talk for news, a good line mattered as much as a good fact. The first wave of popular bounty hunting stories came through cheap print. Dime novels and sensational pamphlets moved through rail depots and general stores and landed in the hands of boys and men who read by lamplight after a long day. The writers pulled from real events, then added sharper edges. They gave hunters clean motives, quick tongues, and perfect aim. They gave outlaws a single defining trait that made them easy to hate. They described chases that covered enormous distances in a few pages. The work on the ground looked slower and messier. A real pursuit often meant days of riding with no sign of the target, then a brief encounter that ended without a dramatic exchange of words. A hunter might spend hours at a livery asking about horses. He might sit in a boarding house and listen for names. He might ride to 3 ranches and find only polite denials. He might return to town with nothing and start again the next week. Those realities rarely sold well on a printed page. Print favored clear scene. A writer could place the hunter in a dusty street, describe a hand moving toward a gun, and end the chapter with the outlaw on the ground. The reader could close the book feeling a conclusion. The real world offered loose ends, mistaken identities, and fugitives who slipped away in the dark. Public performances did even more to shape the image. Traveling shows brought riding exhibitions, staged robberies, and mock arrests to towns that had never seen a large theatre. A famous showman could hire riders, buy costumes, and build a routine that fit an hour. A bounty hunter in that setting looked like a single man acting alone, because a lone hero played better under bright lights. The audience could track one face and one set of actions. The show could end with applause. The show could end with the criminal led away in full view. On the frontier, real captures often depended on groups. A deputy brought 2 or 3 men because a fugitive could shoot and run at the same time. A federal marshal relied on local guides. A railroad agent relied on informants. A sheriff relied on whoever would join a posse at dawn. The hunter also relied on a clerk who would pay the reward only after identity was confirmed. Those steps belonged to paperwork and conversation. A stage show avoided those steps because they slowed the action and because the audience could not see them from the back row. Early films pushed the same pattern into a new form. A camera could capture a rider galloping across open land, dust flying from hooves, coat flapping behind. A director could stage a gunfight in the street, with actors who knew where to stand and when to fall. The film could show a wanted poster in close view, then cut to the hunter pinning the poster to a wall, then cut to a chase. The audience could understand the plot without a long explanation. Many films also used the words dead or alive because the phrase carried a hard charge and because it promised that a confrontation would happen. In practice, the phrase carried legal and moral consequences that shifted from place to place. A county might pay only for a living prisoner. A private offer might pay for proof of death. A lawman might insist on an arrest to avoid trouble with a judge. A hunter who killed the wrong man could face local anger, a sheriff's questions, and a threat of retaliation from family or friends. Those consequences rarely fit inside the runtime of a short film. The camera favored the moment of violence, the fall, and the quick ride back to town. This set of images also changed how people remembered real events. A town might recall a capture as a duel because the duel fit the stories people already knew. Yet many real confrontations happened from cover, at close range, and at awkward angles. A fugitive might be shot while turning away. A hunter might fire through a doorway. A posse might surround a cabin at dawn and order a man out. If the fugitive refused, the exchange could happen in tight spaces with smoke filling a room. The result could be a dead man on a floor and splintered wood around a doorframe. That scene offered little hero posture and little clean line of sight. Real hunters also had to solve basic problems that rarely appeared on screen. They had to eat and sleep. They had to keep horses in condition. They had to carry food for the horse as well as for themselves. They had to decide whether to cross a river in bad weather. They had to consider whether the target had friends nearby. They had to decide who would stand watch at night. After a capture, they had to transport a prisoner without losing him. They needed rope, cuffs, wagons, and a plan for rest stops. If the prisoner got sick, the hunter had to keep him alive long enough to claim the reward. These decisions shaped the work as much as any shot fired in a street. Even the look of the bounty hunter became standardized through repetition. Films and prints favored a certain outfit because it read well: a long coat, a hat pulled low, a gun belt worn as a signal, a calm face that rarely showed doubt. Real hunters dressed for weather and travel. They wore what they owned. They patched clothing. They carried extra socks. They wrapped their hands when cold winds split the skin. A lawman might wear a badge. A private agent might keep his papers hidden and dress like a traveler. A hunter who hoped to pass unnoticed might avoid flashy gear entirely and carry his weapon under a coat. The work also drew men who drank too much, slept too little, and made careless choices. Stories filtered those men out because they complicated the image. Yet the frontier contained plenty of failed pursuits, false arrests, and wasted weeks. The reward economy rewarded success. The public memory held on to success. The result was a West that came to the public in a simplified shape. A poster on a wall became a direct order. A hunter became a single figure. A capture became a clean ending. The reality continued to run on smaller parts that most spectators never saw. A clerk counting money in a back room. A sheriff arguing with a county commissioner about payments. A witness signing a statement. A prisoner sitting on a bench with wrists bound, watched by men who took turns guarding him. A hunter sleeping on a floor beside a door because he feared an escape attempt in the night. Those scenes lacked music and lacked applause. They were the daily mechanics of pursuit and custody, and they defined the work as much as any gunfight. A clerk in a small courthouse turned a key in a metal filing cabinet and slid out a drawer heavy with paper. Inside, older reward notices lay folded beside warrants and witness statements, their edges softened from handling. The newest papers looked different. Some carried photographs instead of rough sketches. Some included fuller descriptions, printed on better paper, with a longer list of identifiers that a deputy could check in town without guessing. A sheriff sat at a desk nearby with a telegraph form in front of him, and he read it twice before he handed it to a deputy. The message gave a name, a direction, and a time. It mentioned a train. It mentioned a station. The deputy did not saddle up right away. He walked to the window, looked at the street, then reached for his coat and hat with the calm speed of a man who planned to make a connection on schedule. Scenes like this began to appear more often as the 19th century ended. The work of pursuit remained dangerous, and the people involved still carried guns, yet the setting started to change in simple, observable ways. Towns grew larger. Streets carried more traffic. Rail lines reached farther. Communication improved. A fugitive still ran, yet running grew harder when descriptions traveled faster than horses. In the decades when the frontier felt wide open, a bounty could function like a public call for help, and it could draw in whoever felt bold enough to answer. A rancher could offer money for stolen cattle and depend on neighbors to ride. A county could offer money for a murderer and depend on local men to search. As the years moved into the early 20th century, that casual pool of hunters shrank in many places. People still wanted safety, and they still wanted criminals caught, yet they also lived in communities with more structure. Counties expanded their law enforcement budgets. Towns hired more officers. State governments increased their role in policing. Federal offices grew more organized in how they tracked fugitives who crossed state lines. A sheriff's office that once held only a few guns and a simple jail could now hold records, photographs, and regular communication with other jurisdictions. Rail companies continued to employ agents and detectives, and those agents gained easier access to telegraph offices, passenger records, and station masters who recognized suspicious behavior. A reward still existed, yet it often served as an addition to a wider net of enforcement rather than the main tool. The change also showed up in the way criminals moved. An outlaw in the 1870 seconds could ride into a small town, buy supplies, and leave before anyone made a clear connection between his face and a notice tacked to a wall. By the 1900s, the same person faced more barriers. Photographs spread. Arrest records followed. A man who used a train could be noticed by conductors and station agents. A man who used a hotel left a register entry. A man who tried to pass through a larger city faced patrolmen on busy streets. Even the basic habits of identification advanced. Sheriffs began to exchange detailed physical descriptions. Some departments began to use fingerprinting as the practice spread, and it gave officers a way to confirm identity in a way a beard and a hat never could. A fugitive could still change his name, yet a photograph and a set of records made reinvention harder. Each added layer reduced the space in which a freelance hunter could operate on instinct alone. The work shifted toward organized investigation and away from a single rider showing up with a prisoner and demanding a payout at the clerk's window. In Oklahoma Territory, the changes arrived with statehood in 1907 and the steady expansion of courts and prison. The territory had already seen some of the most famous manhunts of the late 19th century, including the pursuit of the Doolin Gang and its associates. As those years passed, the public appetite for large rewards remained, yet the environment that produced the classic bounty hunter role began to fade. A criminal still drew attention, yet the response increasingly involved officers acting under formal authority rather than local men acting on a cash promise. A fugitive could still be taken by a private person, yet the systems around capture became more formal. Paperwork mattered more. Evidence mattered more. A sheriff who accepted a prisoner had to answer to judges who demanded procedure. A county budget faced scrutiny. Towns also began to see more regulation of weapons and public conduct, especially in places that grew into cities. The old pattern of a street confrontation between armed men still occurred, and it remained deadly. Yet the tolerance for it decreased as officials sought order and as citizens demanded it. When violence happened, it produced investigation rather than a quick acceptance of whatever story reached the courthouse first. The last rewards of the old style tended to appear in specific situations where organized enforcement still faced limits. Remote areas still existed, and criminals used them. Mountain districts, desert routes, and sparsely settled plains continued to offer hiding places. Ranchers and mining companies still offered money for stolen property and for fugitives who threatened their operations. Yet even in those settings, the hunt often involved cooperation with deputies who carried broader support than earlier generations had. A posse could include men who served regularly rather than neighbors gathered for a single ride. Transportation changed too. The appearance of automobiles added speed in some areas, and it changed the way officers and suspects moved. A fugitive could travel faster on roads where a horse once held the advantage. An officer could also cover more ground with a vehicle when roads allowed it. The horse remained important in many regions, and it remained the best tool in rough terrain. Yet the presence of motor travel signaled a shift. A hunter who built his identity around saddle work faced a world where the chase could take place along roads and rail corridors rather than along creek beds and fence lines alone. As the 20th century progressed, the idea of a bounty did not vanish. It changed form. The most visible successor emerged through bail and court systems. In that system, money served as a guarantee that a defendant would appear in court, and a private party could become responsible for returning a person who failed to appear. The work of bringing someone back remained physical and risky in some cases. It involved addresses, travel, and confrontations at doors. It involved paperwork and court deadlines. Yet it existed inside a modern legal framework where the purpose centered on ensuring court appearance rather than paying for the capture of a notorious outlaw after a train robbery. Some of the old tools stayed familiar: a description, a photograph, a name. The job relied less on a poster nailed to a public wall and more on records, court documents, and direct coordination with law enforcement. The cultural image of the bounty hunter remained strong, yet the daily work grew less tied to the frontier economy of rewards and more tied to the expanding machinery of courts and policing. In the West itself, the closing of the open range and the growth of permanent communities reduced the space that allowed the classic fugitive to survive. Fences appeared in greater numbers. Ranch boundaries became clearer. Towns became more connected. A man traveling alone drew attention in places where everybody recognized each other. Even in larger places, the flow of information improved enough that a wanted face could be identified more quickly. The old reward notices still appeared sometimes, yet they carried a different tone. They felt like a leftover tool used for special cases rather than a daily practice that held communities together. The last of the big frontier rewards belonged to the end of an era when law enforcement depended on personal courage, local knowledge, and quick cash offers. That era left behind real names and real bodies, and it left behind a record of how a society tried to buy order when it could not always enforce it through formal institutions. A man in a pressed shirt stood in a quiet room decades later and looked through a glass case at a faded reward notice. The paper had browned at the edges. The ink had bled where rain once touched it. The portrait looked like a rough guess, a face drawn by someone who had seen the outlaw in motion. The words still read clearly enough to make the meaning plain. A name, a list of accusations, a sum of money offered for capture. The man leaned closer until his breath fogged a small circle on the glass. Then he straightened and glanced toward the corner where a clerk sat at a desk, answering questions for visitors. The clerk handled the paper items with gloves, turning pages slowly, pointing to a line of handwriting, then closing the folder again. The room held quiet sounds: shoes on wood, the soft click of a drawer closing, a page turning. In places like this, the West survived as objects: a wanted notice, a badge, a pistol, a set of shackles, a faded photograph of men standing stiffly outside a jail. The story of bounty hunting lived inside those objects because the work itself left a paper trail and a body count, and people kept both. In the years when reward notices shaped daily life, the practice carried a practical purpose that anyone could understand. A small town could not pay for a large force. A county sheriff might have one deputy, and that deputy might be out on a long ride when trouble hit. A reward offer expanded the number of people looking for a fugitive. It turned travelers, ranch hands, and businessmen into possible witnesses and possible pursuers. It also turned daily suspicion into a tool. People watched strangers and asked questions because money waited at the end of a correct answer. That same system pulled in men who acted with speed and violence because speed and violence often brought results. The West produced many lawful captures and many dangerous confrontations. It also produced killings justified with a few sentences and a nod from a local official. When the reward said dead or alive, the words shaped behavior. A hunter could treat a man as a target rather than a prisoner. A sheriff could accept a body and consider the job done. Families of the dead had little leverage in places where courts met rarely and where witnesses dispersed. The practice did not create violence out of thin air. It gave violence a formal payout. The moral record of bounty hunting sits in individual cases because the work depended on personal choices made under pressure. Some hunters aimed for arrests and tried to keep a fugitive alive because a living prisoner could speak in court and confirm identity. Some hunters fired early because they feared being shot first. Others used deceit and waited for a clean moment that reduced risk. Many hunters lived in the grey space between law enforcement and private profit. The Dunn brothers showed how that space could collapse into betrayal. They offered hospitality and familiar faces, then used a planned ambush to claim reward money when Bitter Creek Newcomb and Charlie Pierce arrived at their place expecting safety. The reward sums were large enough to change a family's finances, and the decision followed that reality. The price showed up later in fear, suspicion, and violence in their own town. When Frank Canton shot Bill Dunn in the street after Dunn tried to draw, the moment made a public point that people understood in their bones. A bounty hunter and a lawman could become the same kind of threat in different hands. A town that lived on reward money also lived under the shadow of who might turn on whom next. Frank Canton's own life carried a different kind of lesson because it showed how flexible identity could be on the frontier. He began as Joe Horner, an outlaw and robber, then escaped custody, changed his name, and worked as a lawman. That change took place through ordinary steps, new towns, new acquaintances, steady work, and the willingness of officials to accept a man as he presented himself. His later confession and pardon revealed the bargain at the heart of frontier enforcement. Results mattered. A man who could ride, shoot, and track could become useful even with a dangerous past. People who lived then often measured a lawman by what he stopped and what he prevented. They saw the bodies of victims and the fear in town streets. They wanted a person who could keep order. That demand created space for reinvention, and it created space for hypocrisy. A man could wear a badge while carrying secrets that would have ended his career in a place with stronger records and faster communication. As towns grew and courts became steadier, the reward system lost some of its central role, yet its influence stayed in how Americans talked about justice. The image of a lone hunter tracking a criminal persisted, even when law enforcement became more organized and more bureaucratic. The language persisted too. Wanted notices remained in use. Rewards still appeared for major crimes. The public continued to feel a certain satisfaction when a famous fugitive was captured, especially when the capture ended a long series of robberies or killing. Yet the same satisfaction could hide serious problems. Reward money encouraged shortcuts, it encouraged false accusations, it encouraged staged captures and quiet deals. It rewarded the person who arrived with proof, rather than the person who showed restraint. Communities learned to live with that tension. They posted notices anyway because they wanted results and because they had limited options. Modern versions of bounty work exist inside a different structure, and the differences show up in paperwork and routine. A bail enforcement agent works from court documents, addresses, and schedules rather than from posters nailed to post office walls. The work still involves travel, waiting, and confrontation, and it still can involve mistakes. The incentives resemble the older system in one basic way. Payment arrives through a specific result, and that result pressures a person to move fast. The older frontier model added more personal violence because it often centered on outlaws who carried weapons and expected shootouts. The modern system centers on court appearances, bonds, and administrative deadlines. The work still raises questions about accountability and oversight, and people still argue about the role such agents should play. The argument carries echoes of the 19th century because the core issue remains the same. A society wants enforcement, and it also wants restraint. The legacy also lives in the way people choose heroes. Some communities remembered hunters as protectors. They told stories about the day a dangerous man was taken off the roads. They spoke about safer stage routes and fewer robberies. Other communities remembered hunters as profiteers who made money from suffering and who escalated violence in the process. Both memories can be supported with real events. Many hunters did remove dangerous criminals. Many hunters also killed men who might have been captured alive, and many hunters crossed lines for profit. The West did not offer a single verdict. It offered a record of cases and the human costs that followed each case. The record includes reward notices written in bold ink. It includes courtroom statements. It includes graves with dates carved into stone. It includes families who moved away after a killing and never returned. A bookkeeper closed a ledger at the end of a workday in an old courthouse, pressed the cover flat with both hands, and tied it with a cord. The ledger held names, payments, and short notes about what had been delivered and when. Those notes turned lives into entries and turned violence into accounting. The West ran on that kind of record as surely as it ran on horses and rifles. Reward money-shaped decisions in kitchens, boarding houses, saloons, sheriff offices, and on open roads. It brought some men to justice. It brought other men to an early death. It created careers built on pursuit and fear. It left behind paper that still sits in drawers, waiting for a curious hand to pull it out and read the numbers again.